So last time we actually talked about the radical skepticism about race. This time we're going to talk about racial constructionism. According to racial constructionism, races exist, but they're grounded in our social practices. Remember, this is the kind of view that Berkeley, the famous idealist, espoused about ordinary objects. He said, ordinary objects exist, they're just grounded in our minds. Their essence is to be perceived. Whereas a realist would say, no, ordinary objects exist independently of us thinking and talking about them. Well, the racial constructionist says races are kind of like Berkeley thought ordinary objects are, and not like the realist thinks ordinary objects are. Okay, so let's look at a few different kinds of radical racial constructivism. There's ordinary racial constructionism, which says this: there's really nothing deep in common shared by members of any race group. All they have in common is that we group them. So aside from trivial things like skin color and hair texture maybe and facial morphology, that is, aside from the kind of features by which we ordinarily at the superficial level recognize someone visually as a member of a certain race group, setting aside those features, there's just no unity there. There's nothing interesting. There's nothing you could predict by knowing someone's skin color about that person's psychology or behavior or anything interesting. That's the racial constructionist line. There's just nothing interesting there except the fact that we group people. So people count as a member of a certain race group because we group them that way. And we should say that there are races because we group them that way, because it's an interesting grouping. It's a socially interesting grouping. It allows us to sort of predict certain things about society. Another version of racial constructionism, this is associated with, not when it comes to race, but in the general case, with a philosopher named Ian Hacking, who advanced a view called interactive kind constructivism. And what he said is that sometimes the fact that we treat people as members of a certain group, actually starts to affect their psychology and their behavior. Not through any sort of genetic transmission, just through sort of ordinary conditioning. So you can think of the idea like this. According to the interactive kind constructivist about race, ordinary constructionism starts out true. That is, initially, ordinary constructionism was true of race groups. That is, there was nothing to being, say, black or nothing to being, say, white than the fact that we group some people as black and we group other people as white. But over time, because black people get treated in a certain way and white people get treated in a certain way, they start to develop an interesting kind of psychological unity. Now, it might not be a pervasive unity, but it might be an interesting unity nonetheless. That is, there might be certain features that people do, really interesting features, psychological and behavioral features that people share in virtue of being black. But it's not because that feature is genetically driven. It's because one who is treated the way we treat black people ends up having that feature. The final view is Haslinger's constructivism. And Haslinger's constructivism, I realize I'm switching between constructionism and constructivism. Constructivism is a more familiar term, but Malin uses constructionism, so I'm following him. At least that's my memory, is that he uses constructionism. So anyway, according to Haslinger, she adopts that kind of stipulative view that we talked about last time. That's the error of Carnap, where the point of semantic investigation isn't to uncover pre-existing meanings for terms. It's rather to stipulate fruitful meanings for terms. For Carnap, fruitful meant that it was useful for future theorizing, and for Haslinger, it means something like it's useful for achieving political goals. Either way, there are races, according to Haslinger. They're just the result of our choices. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about Haslinger's view, in part because the paper is interesting, and in part because there's the reason that it was assigned. So according to Haslinger, we should choose a definition for race. Remember, it's up to us what races are because we're choosing definitions for race terms based on political usefulness. Choose a definition that fits our goals. So we're not trying to track actual use or people's intuitions about how terms apply or their dispositions to apply terms. We're just trying to choose a definition that fits our goals. And what's our goals? Well, our goals are to create a more just society. And given that we're choosing a definition to achieve the goal of a more just society, says Haslinger, we should define race groups as follows. Group G is racialized. Notice that since we're sort of choosing what the groups are, they're not, she's shifting from talk of race, because that makes it sound like it's there for us to find, to talk of being racialized. So it's emphasizing that we're creating the group. Group G is racialized relative to a context C. If and only if, by definition, members of G are all and only those who, and then we're going to say something about them. So in order to be a member of a race group, you have to be observed or imagined to have certain bodily features presumed in that context to be evidence of ancestral links to a certain geographical region. So the first thing is we have to look at you in order for you to be a member of a certain race group. When we look at you, we have to presume that you're a member of a certain race group, basically. That is, that you have we have to look at you and see certain features, or think we see certain features that provide evidence of link to, say, Africa or Europe or the Middle East or Persia or China or Japan or whatever. Second, your having or being imagined to have those features has to mark you in a context with a certain background ideology as appropriately occupying certain kinds of social positions that are in fact either subordinate or privileged. So for example, the idea goes, in many contexts, if I look at you and the features that you have make me think that your ancestors came from sub-Saharan Africa, that will make me think the following, that you are subordinate in a variety of ways given the nature of our society. And your satisfying those two conditions will play some role in your systematic subordination. Okay. Now notice that she says along some dimension here, because it may be that a single individual can be privileged for, say, being male in some ways and disadvantaged for, say, being male in other ways. So it's along some dimension. I guess I shouldn't have said male and male. I should have said you can be privileged for being white in some ways and disadvantaged in other ways. Of course, Haslinger thinks that the privilege will typically go along with being white, and the subordination will typically go along with being black, that is, being racialized as white or racialized as black. But in principle, it could cut both directions. Okay, so in rough summary, here's Haslinger's idea. Here's the most useful definition for race. A group is racialized if, when you look at them, you think that their ancestors came from a certain region, and that fact marks them as it appropriately occupying certain kinds of social positions. So it's like, it marks you as, say, being poor, and it being just that you're poor, that is, you deserve to be poor. And you're satisfying that is, the fact that we see you that way and that it makes it seem just to us that you're poor plays a role in keeping you poor, or in your having become poor. Okay. So there's the kind of thing Haslinger has in mind. Now, I want you to notice that Haslinger's definition makes whether or not someone belongs to a certain race group depend on whether or not people judge that person to belong to that race group. Why is this interesting? Well, take the case of Rachel Dolezal. Remember, Rachel Dolezal was a woman, I believe in Washington State, who was the head of her local NAACP chapter, and her ancestors are all European. But if you look at her, you can search for pictures of her on the internet. She appears to be black. That is, if you looked at her, you might think, oh, she's black. You might not, but you might. So why does this matter? Well, it means that people will judge her to be black. Now, if people's judgment that she is black leads to her occupying a certain disadvantaged social position, then it ends up being the case that according to Haslinger's definition, she is black. That's something to notice. I'm not saying that means Haslinger's position is wrong. It's just something interesting to notice. Okay, so we're going to stop our discussion of race there. I think racialism is clearly false. I think racial population naturalism, even if true, doesn't track ordinary usage. So the only way it's true is if we go with this Carnap kind of Haslinger line, where we should introduce theoretically useful definitions for terms and don't worry about tracking ordinary uses of those terms. Racial constructionism is plausible. Radical skepticism is plausible. you can sort of look further into the dialectic to see what you might want to choose. Okay, and we'll stop this session there, this segment there.